There we go. Okay, so I am going to introduce Steve, I guess. Is that okay? Could go right into it.
You bet.
Steve, I met, well, I didn't meet you, but I met some people at the Reading Foundation here in Vancouver, probably, let's see, 8 years ago. No, almost 10 years ago. Yeah, my son is 24 and he started going to the Reading Foundation when he was 13. So I have 2 kids that have been diagnosed with dyslexia. One has severe dyslexia. She's in university right now and on the honor roll. Proud mom here. The other one, my son graduated from UBCO last year, 2 years ago on the honor roll, thanks to the Reading Foundation, I believe. And as all of you know, if you're coming as a parent, that dyslexia is a different experience for everyone, as well as you need to kind of search out what your kid needs because every kid needs something specific. And I found with the Reading Foundation that they really individualized whatever program or remedial program that the child needed, and I very much appreciated it. So Steve has done a couple presentations for us up to today, and we have some big news out of BC in December. I was just telling Steve that our new premier actually wrote an education mandate that included dyslexia initiatives. I'm still trying to find out what those dyslexia initiatives are. So when Steve had mentioned he wanted to talk about diagnosing dyslexia and actually discussing how to treat it, I was very excited. So anyways, that's my beginning for Dr. Truch. So why don't you talk a bit about yourself?
Okay, well, thanks for that unpaid testimonial, Cathy. It's very heartwarming, and it's certainly the reason that people always ask me, how come you're not retired? You should be retired, and I'm not, because I just love what I do, and I love hearing stories like this, and they pop up, it seems to me, all the time, in different places. So thank you very much. I've been an educator for over 50 years, and I just figured out today that I've been a psychologist for 47 years. So I've lived through an awful lot of things and a lot of changes in the system as such, and etc. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. What I'm going to do this evening is talk about defining and treating dyslexia, but I'm going to broaden the topic a little bit too, because I don't think you can just confine reading difficulties to the term dyslexia. So, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about our remedial programs. The Reading Foundation is something that I started 32 years ago. 1990 in Calgary was the first one. And what we currently offer are intensive one-to-one remedial programs in the core literacy area. So that includes reading for spelling and reading, meaning for comprehension, discover writing for complete written expression, and then discover math. So in the discover reading program, we do not ignore comprehension and we don't ignore writing, but there are students who need more in-depth treatment in those areas, or remediation in those areas. So we have those separate programs. And in the Discover Math program, when I set out the templates for it and wanted it written, I wanted it to be consistent with the objectives of what kids were learning in school. So in Western Canada, we use the Western Canadian objectives, and we teach the math curriculum-based concepts for grades from kindergarten to grade 8. And in Ontario, we use the Ontario objectives, and we go from grade 1 to grade, curriculum-based math in Western Canada goes to grade 9. And in Ontario, we go to grade 8. So there's just a slight difference there. But we do this intensive one-to-one remedial programs. Intensive means intensive. Ideally, we have students come to us every day for 4 hours of one-on-one. People are usually horrified when they hear that, but we found that that particular model works really well. So 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, and 20 hours, you can cover an awful lot of ground if you're doing the right things. So I'm going to take a few quotes this evening and talk about Dr. Shaywitz's book.
Steve,
Yes.
You're not sharing your screen if that's what you're meaning to do. We can't see the
Oh.
presentation.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm going to escape here for a minute. I'm going to go back to Zoom here. Zoom, where are we? Uh-oh. Okay, help me out here, Amanda. Why is this not sharing?
On the bottom, oh, maybe.
Oh, wait a minute. There, wait, I got it. I got it. Share screen. Here we go. Here we go. I'm so sorry, folks. Pardon. I've been around for 55 years, but this new technology, it'll take me another 50 to learn it all. Okay, we'll start that all over again. I don't know if you heard what I said before, but I'm going to broaden the topic a little bit. I did start the Reading Foundation Clinic in Calgary in 1990, so that's been going for 32 years. I've been a psychologist for like 47 years. I can't believe that. We have intensive remedial programs for the core literacy areas, and we call them all Discover reading, meaning, writing, and math. We do incorporate comprehension and writing activities in the Discover reading program. You can't really avoid it, but there are students who require more in-depth intervention in those areas, so we have those separated out. And we also have Discover Math that is based on the curriculum concepts for Western Canada for grades 1 to 9, and in Ontario for grades 1 to 8. So I also said I will be dealing with parts of Dr. Shaywitz's most recent book, the second edition of Overcoming Dyslexia. I really want to put in a kudo for this book. It's really good. Dr. Shaywitz and her husband have been involved in the Connecticut long-term dyslexia study now for close to 20 years. So they have an incredible amount of experience with dyslexia and a lot of very good practical things to say about it. So we'll use a few quotes here and there. So what I really liked out of her original book was the Sea of Strengths model of dyslexia, which she continues in the second edition, where decoding is the heart of the issue. So the child's inability to sound out words and learn to sound them out and learn to retain them is the heart of the dyslexia problem. But most children are surrounded by what she calls the Sea of Strengths. So they may have very, very positive strengths in things like comprehension or general knowledge or problem solving, vocabulary, critical thinking, reasoning, concept formation. You name it, they have unexpected difficulties, though, with reading and spelling. So the 21st century definition, which is now public law in the United States, now this is federal law, and the state laws are different. So, you have these variations in definitions, which is problematic. I think in terms of diagnosis and treatment, if you're trying to get a core group of students who are so-called dyslexic. So the term dyslexia has come to mean now, and this is how it's written in the law, an unexpected difficulty in reading for individuals who has the intelligence to be a much better reader, most commonly caused by a difficulty in phonological processing, which is defined as the appreciation of the individual sounds of spoken language, and that affects the ability of the individual to speak, read, and spell. So that's the public definition in the US, federal definition. And then it's broadened in the DSM. The DSM and the 5th edition of it is the Bible, you might say, for psychiatrists and psychologists for classifying and categorizing and diagnosing over 300 different disorders. And some of those are called in the literacy area, they're called specific learning disorders. So specific learning disorders are slow and effortful word reading, difficulty understanding the meaning of a word, difficulties with spelling, difficulties with written expression, difficulties with math, number facts, or mathematical reasoning. So you're seeing they're broadening it out to something that goes beyond just word reading. And then you can get finer with a diagnosis with an impairment in reading that affects either accuracy, fluency, or comprehension. And then there's a kind of a little paragraph right at the end of the page there that says that dyslexia is an alternative term used to refer to a pattern of learning difficulties characterized by problems with accurate or fluent word recognition, poor decoding, and poor spelling. So those are the core symptoms that we see all the time. If the term dyslexia is used, it's important also to specify any additional difficulties that are present, such as difficulties with reading comprehension or math reasoning. So they're trying to sort of focus in on the term dyslexia to be with that word reading issue. And I like this one. This is a scholarly definition that was just pointed out to me recently. This is a textbook that's used in many colleges and universities across the country, across North America. dyslexia is a word level reading disorder. That cuts to the chase and gets rid of a lot of the verbiage involved with the term. Now, what is the prevalence of dyslexia? Here we start running into some of the problems of not having a tight definition, or not having parameters that we need to use to diagnose. So since dyslexia is estimated to comprise at least 80% of all learning disabilities, we can infer that about 2 million children, or 4% of the school population, are receiving special educational services for dyslexia. So it's an inference you're making. This, by the way, is a quote from Dr. Sheos's recent book from page 29. So we go from, all of a sudden, and this is from the same book, data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress indicates that overall less than half of all students are proficient in 4th grade reading. So now you've got something like half of the school population. And then we go data from our Connecticut longitudinal study indicates that dyslexia affects approximately 1 child in 5. So now we're at 20%. So we go from 4% to close to 50% to 20%. So what is it? Well, let's talk a little bit about some misconceptions about reading delays and dyslexia. Reading delays are often seen as or thought to be based on a visual problem of some sort, visual tracking, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, there's surface validity to that because the children do display things like reversals and their eyes seem to sort of skip all over the page. But the tight kind of research that's done on this problem really shows that is not the issue at all. So yes, reading is visual, and you have to see letters. So if you're blind, then that's going to be a problem of some sort that will interfere with reading. But you can still learn to read with other ways, because what you need to learn is a code of some kind, whether it's Braille or our system of English spelling. You have to learn the code in order to be able to read. So the visual part represents the code. So that's the part that's missing, the auditory, the phoneme. The visual part, the alphabet letter, represents the phoneme. The second misconception is that it's a developmental lag that the student is going to outgrow, or is some sort of a late bloomer. Yes, there are late bloomers. You cannot deny that children suddenly can learn to read, but I think, again, when you dig deeply, you find that some of the issues that were delaying their development in reading in the first place are still there, but the child is now compensated or accommodated in some way. That the problem affects boys more than girls. Actually, there's a closer ratio in our clinics to boys and girls. The genders differences are not that great, and I don't think that there's a significant discrepancy. Boys, of course, tend to be overrepresented because they are such problems in the classroom. And that the problem is due to laziness. Most often it's not. The child is just turned off most of the time because they haven't been learning for a while. And so they appear to be lazy. Now, again, that's not to say that some children are not lazy. I think some children are, have to be given a little push here and there. Or that students just need a bit more practice or a bit of tutoring. Typically, that will only work for students who are kind of mildly delayed. But if they have any more serious delays, that is not going to work at all. So we come to the core of the definition of dyslexia, which is a phonological core deficit. That's the hypothesis. So definitions and descriptions of both dyslexia and learning disabilities for reading and spelling emphasize its origin in a phonological weakness or a phonological core deficit. So what exactly is that? Well, it is, first of all, unrelated to intelligence. So many children who are very bright have this core deficit, and it affects their reading and spelling. And others whose cognitive abilities are not as great, but who have strong phonological skills, can learn to read and spell effectively, though their comprehension may not follow. So the initial stages, though, of reading and spelling, including alphabet recognition. So if your child is having difficulty recognizing the letters of the alphabet, difficulty retaining the letters of the alphabet, remembering them all the time. And it does take a long time for kids to learn the alphabet, but that is a key sign, especially if they start avoiding it. and then phoneme and awareness and manipulation. So what we mean by that is, let's take a word like cat. If you say the word cat and you ask the child to say cat, and then say the word cat without the k. So you're asking the child to segment out the first sound of that particular word and then retain the other two sounds. So the child should say at. So if you say cat, now instead of say now the child has to do something more deeper. It has to do some manipulation. They would have to take out the middle sound, which is difficult for them to hear in the first place, and exchange it and then blend the remaining part to come up with cut. So you can see that that is definitely a core foundation for learning an alphabet system. And if the child is weak in this area, and there's so much research now to say that, phonological awareness is central to the whole issue of reading and spelling for any readers, and in particularly for students who are delayed in these areas, the ramifications of poor phonemic awareness can continue on for many years. Listening and speaking can be affected as well, because a child may not hear words properly or mishear the words, and same with misspeaking some words, paschetti instead of spaghetti, like that. Heredity also seems to play a part as well, but of course it's always the father's fault, so we'll just leave it at that. Now, is it a brain disorder? According to Shaywitz on page 65 of her book, in the condition of what they're calling developmental dyslexia. So this would be something where which is there from birth, you might say, or prior to that if it's genetic. Where reading has failed to develop normally, something's gone awry right from the beginning. Consequently, we would not expect to find a distinct lesion. And that's an important point, because adults who have heard about MRIs and so on want to have their brain scans, and if they've been diagnosed with dyslexia, they want to see what's wrong with their brain. And when you do those kinds of studies, the brain scanning studies, you don't find anything wrong with the brain. So it's something more subtle than that. So what she's saying is the wiring may not have been laid down correctly in the first place. All those synapses that start, sprouting when the child is a few months old, a few weeks old, actually, there's a glitch that takes place during the fetal development or early life when the brain is hardwired for language. So as a result, tens of thousands of neurons, millions of them really, carrying the phonological messages necessary for language don't appropriately coalesce to form the resonating networks that make skilled reading possible. So in my clinical experience, I've always wondered and marveled at how students can be so delayed when they're 4 and 5 years old. And we see that all the time in the clinic, actually. And you think, well, how did that even happen? They haven't even been taught anything or next to nothing. But there it is. And so I think that this developmental dyslexia is a term that makes sense to me from just a practical point of view. We contrast that with acquired dyslexia, and that's where it takes a bit longer for the symptoms of weak reading and spelling to surface. And I think that has much more to do with how the child is taught than anything else. So we'll get into that in a big time way in a few minutes here. Now, the caveat is that depending on the nature or the severity of this fault in the wiring, we would expect to observe variations in varying degrees of reading, and then I put in brackets, and spelling difficulty. So spelling is often overlooked here, and I think it's actually central. So this leads to what I'm calling the degree of severity or degree of delay continuum, which applies to both phonological delays and subsequent spelling and reading delays. So here's a normal curve chart here to show you that the level of the severity of the phonological core deficit is on a continuum. And if we're going with the left-hand side of the normal curve here, we have children that will be in the average range, we'll say, for the phonological core deficit. Those children don't necessarily need a whole lot of phonological activity, but they need some sort of a boost. And I'll show you some data where children who are in the average range in our clinic that did come got a huge boost from the kind of approach that we use. And then we have kids in that mild range, the standard scores will say between 89 and 84. They just need some sort of boost. And a lot of times you'll hear success stories from any kind of intervention program, be it Wilson or Orton Gillingham or Reading Foundation, or, Discover Reading. They just needed a little boost and whammo, the whole thing just came together. I mean, those are wonderful stories to hear, But if you did have the data and dug a little deeper, you'd find that probably the phonological issues the student was having were not really that severe. They're on this continuum. And then we have moderate, we have severe, we have ultra severe, and then recently I've added this extremely severe. So these are children where the manifestation in reading and spelling is so severe that their standard scores are below the first percentile on anything that we test. That is horribly delayed. Okay. Now, a major caveat for me that I've learned, I've finally become a teacher, and that is I believe in teaching. So teaching changes everything, and that includes your brain wiring and the subsequent patterning that may have developed because of that brain wiring. So experiences and teaching changes everything, and that could be for the better or for the worse. So we have to remember that. So the brain wiring, if it's wired incorrectly in the first place, can take longer for students to get rewired because of the the delay that the nervous system itself is producing or has already produced. So that leads us into the different ways to teach reading words. Reading words are taught, different approaches to teaching words. So here's the less desirable approaches. Now, these are not my opinions. These are all been pretty much well verified by all kinds of studies that have been done. And the less desirable approaches tend to be memorizing whole words. All of us, I think, memorized a word or two here or there, but as a general approach to reading, that is not a good idea. So the flashcards and just flashing words at children over and over and over again does not lead to anything but frustration. Another very poor approach is to have the child guess at words. And that guessing is also part of the 3Q system, which is used a lot in the balanced literacy approach. And then we have a partial decoding approach, which is not all that horrible, but it involves sounding out part of the word and then guessing at the rest. And guessing at the rest has to come, though, from the child's internal oral lexicon. So there is some research to show that what is called set for variability, or what I was introduced to it as a more fancy sounding term, like the semantic and phonological ability to adjust recoding. How about that one? And then I think a less desirable approach as well is to de-emphasize or ignore spelling, to consider that it's not an important part of literacy at all. Well, it's huge. The more desirable approaches are phonics instruction, and that can be print to speech, that is systematic, or a speech to print phonics instruction, which I borrowed the term linguistic phonics from Dr. Diane McGinnis, that is also systematic. So these are very different approaches to how we introduce the English code. So let's get into that a little bit now. So spelling and reading are based on phonemes in any alphabet system. So any oral language that has written language that is an alphabet, it's based on phonemes. So both spelling and reading start from learning the English code. This is, we're talking now to English. So how the English sounds, there's 44 phonemes, arguably, but we only have 26 letters to spell them. So there's going to be some sort of overlap, and that's where all the confusion comes in. But once students know the basic sound letter connections, now when I say basic, I mean by that term, usually the connection where the letter and the sound are basically one-to-one. So the sound, for example, can be spelled with the letter M, the single letter M, but ch, which is also a single sound, requires two letters. And then all kinds of sounds like can be spelled 5 or 6 different ways. So those can be gradually introduced once the basic ones are solid with the child and they know how to blend the sounds into words. Then they can start reading the word and spelling it, of course, as well. Now that leads me into something that's kind of interesting, and that is, and I hope you find it interesting too, the difference between a transparent and an opaque alphabet. So transparent alphabets are those where the sound and letter connections are basically one-to-one, as I just mentioned. So imagine having your whole alphabet that way. And examples of alphabets that are like that are Hebrew, Swedish, Italian, Spanish, and lots of other European languages. Whereas opaque alphabets are those where the sound and letter correspondences are one-to-many, and the best examples are English and French. Now, isn't that interesting? Now, what's even more interesting is the data that's been done on that, the studies that have been done on that. And students in countries with transparent alphabets are typically good spellers and readers and by the end of grade 1. Wow, that's a powerful statement. Typically good spellers and readers by the end of grade 1. Some, but very few by proportion, are delayed. Now, where English is taught, the students who are proficient may not surface until grade 3 or 4 or 5, and very high proportions are delayed. And this is where we get into all kinds of trouble. The trouble with English is teaching English. So the keys, let's say we talk about 2 keys here. How do we prevent spelling and reading difficulties and delays? Well, preventing spelling and reading delays starts with early identification and appropriate teaching in kindergarten and grade 1. This is just study after study says, you know, the earlier you catch this, the better it is for the child, the better it is for everybody involved, the family, parents, everything, all that anguish. So it's interesting that I attended a Canadian dyslexia presentation by Dr. George Georgiou a few months ago. And I found out an awful lot of very wonderful things are taking place in Alberta, right here in my backyard, actually, with Dr. Georgiou's program. Now, his is not a speech-to-print program, but it is a phonics program that goes from print to speech, but it's very systematic and it teaches all the options of the English code. And they've amassed a mountain of data to show how effective it is, and they're starting to shift that curve of students who are delayed. There's just not as many children in grade 2 and 3 now in the systems that have used this. And there are, I think, 16 school districts, the whole district, so thousands of students involved here who are into his program. Is called the Phonics Companion. You can buy it if you're a teacher from Pearson is the Pearson Education. And I looked at pretty carefully at the program, and I really do like it. I think it's a lesson to me not to develop a bias one way or the other. Lots of things will work. Some things will work better than others, though. And I want to bring out an interesting point that I heard a couple of years ago from a presentation from the Reading League from Dr. Stephen Dykstra. And he had what he called the bullseye analogy. You can imagine the bullseye right now. And there, after nearly 100 years of reading research, there are only 3 conclusions that we can draw firmly that hit the bullseye. There's no arguments. Okay, what are they? Well, good readers are good decoders. Phonemic awareness is important. And teaching phonics is better than not teaching phonics. To me, I think that's kind of pathetic. We have to go further than that. But after 100 years of reading research, that's all we can say with solid 100%, no argument on those issues. Now, he also does say, well, you can still have good, techniques that kind of, hit the mark or are closer, at least they're on target. So the early identification is terribly important. And in Alberta, the Department of Education, which does not really control how you teach, it just controls certain things. But the province did a survey and found out that only 22% of the school districts in the province did any kind of screening at all. So the first thing that's going to happen in September this year in Alberta is that the schools are going to have to develop a plan for screening the children very early. This is really an important shift, because when I was a school psychologist, all you did was, test kids in grade 3, because it was like, well, they have to have 2 years of schooling before they can be delayed 2 years, because the definition of a reading disability is delayed 2 years. So you get into these, really ridiculous situations. Now, effective and evidence-based instructional methods that systematically teach sound-led connections.
Can I bring something up?
Sure.
So a lot of districts in BC, and I'm sure that maybe in Alberta as well, they'll use screeners that are developed by the teachers in the district, or one that they really like. So it's based on balanced literacy.
Yes.
So would that 20% in Alberta be including old?
Any kind of screening at all. Yeah. Any kind of
so they
screening
might not even be proper screeners.
It might not be a good screener at all. That's right. So now, they're starting to say, look, you got to develop a screener, but now you got to show evidence that your screening is picking out those kids, and evidence that what you're doing with them afterwards is working.
So
And I
is
think,
it legislation they've brought in, or it's just a mandate that the government?
well, it'll probably be a curriculum mandate. It won't be
Okay.
legislation as such, yeah, right.
Okay.
All, you know, all this stuff is annoying to me because it's so political.
Oh, I know. I know.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
keep going, sorry.
Yeah, okay. So effective and evidence-based instructional methods systematically teach the sound letter connections of English. So there's my bias is to use the sound to letter approach, what I'm calling linguistic phonics. So those kinds of programs usually start with one-to-one sound letter combinations, and then they move on to the one-to-many. Now, I found that in the United States already, as usual, of course, they're well ahead of the game. In some ways, there are some really good programs. One of them is from EBLI, Evidence-Based Literacy Instruction, and the other one is called Reading Simplified. I think when you're talking about prevention and what should I as a teacher teach in the classrooms, I think first of all, you need training. You just don't, it's not a matter of a few strategies here and there and do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. You need to do something that's pretty packaged for you in a way that, you know, you don't have to create all these lessons yourself. So EBLI Reads does a great job of training, as does Reading Simplified. So those are for the, you know, prevention, we'll say. Now, the key to remediating spelling and reading delays, including dyslexia, is challenging for a number of reasons. And we'll get into some of that in a moment, but programs with the strongest outcomes are based on the linguistic phonics approach. So I did a presentation in the States in the fall, and I did a lot of studying on this linguistic phonics versus what Dr. McInnes calls visual phonics. And basically that comes to speech to print versus print to speech approach. And I was horrified to find that even, say, the National Reading Panel did not take this perspective. So you're still getting a lot of research that's just based on typically taught phonics. And, you know, you get the outcome that is better. But I think that we have to shift the direction and do a lot more on linguistic phonics and spelling and how that works. And there's no question already, I can find a lot of evidence that shows it works much better. And then the intensity depends on my clinical experience on how delayed the students are in the first place. This is a very, very important point. Okay, now I'll just go back to Dr. Shaywitz, and on page 284, I found this very interesting paragraph. So a child with dyslexia who's not identified early, and there's how many of you parents out there, I can't ask the question because I can't see any of you, but you know, how many of your children were identified early? You knew well ahead of the school system that your child was struggling, but nobody else would respond. So if they're not identified, they may require as much as 150 to 300 hours of intensive instruction. And she's talking at least 60 minutes, optimally 90 minutes or more for most school days over a 1 to 3 year period. Now, you add that up over a 1 to 3 year period. If you're talking a 3 year period, you're talking 900 hours to try to close the reading gap between herself and her peers. The longer identification and effective reading instruction are delayed, the longer the child will require to catch up. So that is true to my experience. And in fact, if anything, I think these numbers are still an underestimate for a lot of those children who are severely delayed. So that's rather horrifying. So it's definitely, the onus is on school systems to start getting into that early screening and a proper kind of intervention right from the get-go, so that we have more money and resources to put into the children who need a lot more. Now, there are a few speech-to-print intervention clinics. Of course, I hope you examine what we do, the Reading Foundation, but there's others. There's Halifax Learning in Nova Scotia, and they've been around for, I think, 20-something years. They get good results. And then the Morris Centers, which is a really comprehensive center, including psychiatrists, psychologists, speech therapists, occupational therapists, the whole bit. And they've done a good job as well. So you can follow these up, and all of these clinics, by the way, also offer online as well as personal one-to-one interventions. Halifax Learning is not one-to-one, though. I believe they try to get into groups of 3 to 5 max. And but the hours are still significant for those children. Okay, now here's something that will be a bit controversial for some of you, but this is a chart that I had, a PowerPoint chart I had prepared from Dr. Kilpatrick's essentials of reading instruction, reading intervention. He went through thousands of studies and started to find, what he said was like, we want to see if we can close the gap. So the best way to measure that is with what are called standard score points. So those of you who are familiar with the normal curve understand that, if you measure children on any kind of variable whatsoever, you always get, a few who score really low on whatever you're testing, a few score high, and then the rest in the middle. When you plot it out on the X and Y axis, you get that normal curve going. So he said, okay, what programs, and he looked at what programs give us minimal, what give us moderate, and what gives us substantial gains. And then he defined those as standard score gains of 0 to 5 points. That's in the minimum range. The ones that are moderate will bring you 6 to 9 points, and the ones that are substantial will bring you 12 to as much as 25 points. So let's look at the minimal programs. So one of them is Vaughan and others study, which is a research-based program, and it was a systematic phonics program, but they didn't get a whole lot in the way of gains. Great Leaps is a term I think familiar to a lot of people, if you're teachers. Failure-free reading is also familiar. Not much in the way of results. Fast Forward, that was something that I actually, when the data first came out, I got quite interested in it, got trained in it, and we did try it for a while, but actually it just doesn't work. And the subsequent research has shown there's really not much punch for the reading and spelling stuff. Reading Recovery from Murray Clay. Reading Recovery is sort of the whole language answer to intervention, and there's some success with it, but it works much better. Subsequent research has shown when you do include some sort of systematic phonics with it. Repeated reading is like the word says, it's just repeated reading. It doesn't really teach the child the alphabet principle. Read 180 is another, just a reading program, again, just lots of reading. And then we have this Orton-Gillingham, which is probably going to raise people's hackles here a little bit, but this is what Kilpatrick found. Study after study that where we had Orton-Gillingham mentioned we're just not showing huge gains in standard score points. Now, he also put the Wilson program, this is some of my own digging around that I did afterwards. He also put the Wilson program into this category because it's an offshoot of Orton-Gillingham, which it is. But I went to the Wilson website and I did find some studies that showed you could see gains of about six points with those students. And that's the quote that I gave you before from Dr. Shea was, sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. This one here, what she was talking about was actually the use in a particular private school here of the Wilson program. So she was following up on some studies with children in that school. And that's what they were doing, the Wilson program. So they were getting gains of 6 to points. So we'll put them in that category for tonight. And then the moderate improvements from two studies, Rashad, and then Maureen Lovett, who's a renowned Canadian researcher, works with the Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto. Wonderful program that she's developed from that research called Empower. And they do a lot of good training of teachers, and it's a remedial program that they teach in classrooms like across the country, actually. So it's a pretty decent program. And then the ones with the substantial gains, Dr. Kilpatrick actually got all this information from research done by little old me. That's not even real research, just good data collection. And it started with the publication that Annals of Dyslexia published in 1994. And I've called it LIPS, but it was actually called Auditory Discrimination in Depth at that time. But the LIPS program, Lending and Phoneme Sequencing program, was a good program. We got excellent results. We got standard score gains of about 15 points with our students after about 80 hours of one-on-one. And then another study in Annals of Dyslexia came out touting the value of phonographics as an excellent program. In fact, the claim was that they could do it like 4 or 5 to 10 times faster than the LIPS program. So of course I got interested in that, got trained in it, shift the clinic over to using the phonographics program for several years, did a data compilation. And then I was kind of tired of having to rewrite those programs for clinical use. So just created Discover Reading. And then I did a comparison of all 3 programs. basically the bottom line is very humbling. Is like, of course, I thought Discover Reading was going to be the best and get the best results, but no, they're going to get with these programs, and what's common to them is they are speech to print programs. So what's common to them, if you use a speech to print program, you give enough hours to the student, you are going to get the best gains from all these other programs in terms of remediation. Now, that's not to say that any of these programs aren't good in some way. You're going to get children who do Orton Gillingham or Fast Forward who will blossom. But as a whole, that's not the best route to take. I think as a whole, you're going to look at the data and say, well, what's probably the best one to use? Well, one of these, one of the ones that gives the better results. Now, here's a very dense information chart. And I had a compilation of statistical data of students in our clinic in all three of our clinics actually between January of 2018, December 2020. So we have about 250, close to 250 students. Now, what I did was subtype them on the degree of delay. And the degree of delay goes back to what I showed you here. Okay, so the degree of delay and numbers that I use apply to the reading and spelling of those students, and the phonological core deficit applies in the same way to all of them with the same kind of parameters for numbers. Okay. So we do get a few students. Let's just go over this subtype by subtype. We do get a few students who are average. Now, by average, I define that as a standard score of 95, that's percentile 35, on all of the standardized measures that we use. And the standardized measures we use are for decoding. We use the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement, the 3rd edition. So these are decoding non-words. For reading real words, we use the Wide Range Achievement Test, the 5th edition. And for comprehension, we use the Kaufman Test of Educational 2. It's a brief version for the comprehension subtest. So we have those 3 standardized scores. If they score 95 or more on all of the standardized measures, they fall into the average range. And we did wind up with 18 children. Now you say, well, if they're all in the average range, how do they ever wind up in your clinic? Well, the answer is yeah, they wound up in our clinic because the parents knew that something was still not quite right with them. A school psychologist like myself, if I would have found scores like that on these children, I would have just said, you know, you're an anxious mother, you're overworried, your child is just fine. Look at this, they're average on all of these tests. They're doing just fine. Yeah, but they're bright, and you know, like, no, I just think something's wrong, and they don't like to read, and they're still kind of slow when they read, and etc. So when we took those 18 children and gave them an average hours of 59 hours, when you look at their pre-test standard score on the Wide Range Achievement Test for reading, it was 105. Clearly strong average. Okay, but after 59 hours, the average post-test score was 122. So that's a huge gain, nearly 18 standard score points. And the average gain every hour, which is a metric that I think I copied it from Joseph Torgerson. But the average gain per hour is a really important metric because it allows you to compare all kinds of programs. And you can see what happens here. The average gain per hour for kids in the average range is huge. So 0.38 of a standard score. So every day they're making at least 1 standard score point difference. And yeah, so at the end of 3 weeks, look at that. And then here's the thing, the average CREF, that's the Comprehensive Receptive and Expressive Vocabulary Test. This is the average expressive vocabulary score. It was 117. So these were very bright children, 117. And their pretest standard score was 105. That's a huge gap. Okay, but by the end of the program, that gap was wiped out. These kids were even exceeding what you would have expected based on their vocabulary score. So I think that's really interesting. And then I have a gender differences too, to show you the percentages in each column and each degree of delay. So if you look down, you see average, mild, moderate, severe, and then I have that new category of ultra severe. The severe and ultra severe candidate or children in this cohort did not necessarily have a specific diagnosis of dyslexia. So I just want you to understand that I don't use the diagnosis. I just see how far delayed they are. And once I know how severe the delay is, I can make a pretty good estimate of how many hours the child needs. So the average hours that they complete is not necessarily what we recommend. We typically recommend more, but because it's one-to-one and because it's expensive, people do run out of money. I understand that. I think it's horrible that they have to pay for this, but that's the way it is right now. We do what we can to help you out, but that's just the way it is. But if you have a child in that ultra severe category, for example, here, the average number of hours those children put in was 140, say 141. The recommendation for those children would be a minimum of 200 hours. And go back to Sally Shaywitz's minimum after 3 years, they need 900 hours, a lot of them. Okay, so we're going a long way into that because we have a different program. We have that speech to print program. So I think we're getting more powerful results with each hour, putting it crudely, more bang for your buck for each hour. So the average gain you can see for the ultra severe is still 16 standard score points. That is, folks, that's a huge shift in from where they were to where they are now. Now their post-test standard score is still only 84. It still doesn't even reach the bottom end of the average range, which is 90. Percentile 25. However, if those parents and if those children were able to complete the other 60 hours that we had recommended as a minimum, if you multiply the average gain per hour by 60, you'll come up with something like 7 more standard score points. That puts them right at 90, right in the average range. And everybody else is at least 90. In fact, these severe kids and up are all at the 95 plus 95 plus standard score range. So these are huge differences, big gains. And of course, I'm very proud of this. And the fact that our staff is, well, who they are. They're just wonderful people who are well-trained and who know what they're doing and who can individualize, as you've heard Cathy say. And we get results. So we change lives. That's my motto. We change lives. And I hear stories about that every day. It's beautiful. Okay, so good. We have plenty of question and answer time. So I'm going to, I guess, stop my sharing and just go to the screen. And then there may be some questions that were submitted already on the chat. Do you want to take care of this first, Andrea? Amanda, sorry.
I'll read out the ones that that came first, and we'll sort of go in order.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question was, what are the parameters to determine the severity?
Yeah, it's on the chart actually. So the parameters are outlined there. They're pretty tight. We just use standard scores within a certain range, and so a minimum of 2 standard score points. The two below certain ranges put you in each category.
I
So
think
that's
they wanted to know which assessment you did.
yeah, that's all there too.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, it's all on the chart. I'm sorry, the chart is very dense and we didn't have enough time to look at every little part of it, but everything is there.
Yeah, we can email
That's
the
cool.
chart out in the final. Yeah, so you can see the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next question was, are the comparisons done with equal time spent per day per program?
With the results from the comparison of the LIPS and the phonographics and Discover Reading programs, yes. For the others, no. You know, Kilpatrick didn't have that in mind, so that's it's a bit of an unfair comparison. But I think it holds up to any other studies that will be done or could be done or have been done.
Okay. If a child in grade 1 is taught OG and we see delays but are doing interventions, is there a rush to get the psych ed done early or wait until grade 3? The school wants to wait.
Yeah, well, schools always want to wait because they have such long waiting lists. So I know the story from being a school psychologist. And I would try not to wait, but I want to say that the psych ed, I've done thousands of them. And when I started the clinic, my thought was, I do not want parents to be spending $2,500, $3,000 on a psych ed to tell me that the child has dyslexia, because it is not going to affect the way that I teach them. The way I'm going to teach them is the same as if they had the diagnosis or not have the diagnosis. So I'd rather they spend the money on the actual intervention. Now, it's changed if the government says, okay, we're going to give funding to your child because if they have a diagnosis of dyslexia, then I think you better get it. You know, you also maybe need to have it because later on, some of these children are still going to require accommodations. I mean, you know, they're just too delayed. So if you have a diagnosis of dyslexia or any other, you know, specific diagnosis that allows, let's say, extra time for exams, they're going to need it. You know, so just, you know, get ahead of the curve a little bit and get it done. I hope that answers the question.
From a parent advocacy standpoint, if I could speak up here, yeah, exactly what Steve was saying. In BC, that psych ed diagnosis actually triggers more. We don't get funding for the Q, they call it a Q designation. For kids with learning disabilities, they get designated as category Q. It doesn't trigger funding, but it's supposed to trigger special needs education supports.
Right. So those are,
school won't even give an IEP until you have a psych ed diagnosis.
yeah, and there's the problem. You get into that vicious circle. You know, the child's obviously disabled, but we can't do anything because they don't have a diagnosis.
Yeah. So
you know,
you got to look at the bigger picture from a parent perspective.
Yeah.
I could add, if you do get a private assessment, it can be covered by extended medical. So just throwing that out there. So,
okay.
And once you have that private assessment, you can then claim things like tutoring at the Reading Foundation. You only get back 20% or Orton Gillingham tutoring, not any kind of tutoring, ones that are specifically geared towards remediation. So
right. Yeah,
there is pros to getting the diagnosis, and it doesn't have anything to do with the remediation. So
right on. And you know, it's kind of interesting too, because the histories of the United States and Canada are quite different too in terms of providing services to people. So in the United States, if you get a diagnosis of dyslexia, you can get funding directed to your child, and they will pay for one-on-one intervention for your child. I mean, that's a cry than just getting a lump sum money given to the school district and say, okay, you do with it what you can. Right? Yeah. Okay. And next question.
Okay, a child that needs 160 hours of intensive intervention, is that considered a severe delay?
Well, okay, one of the sort of misunderstandings that can come from that graph, which maybe I didn't point out clearly enough, is that the 160 hours is the average amount of time they completed, not necessarily the average amount, the amount of time we recommended. So the child in that 160 category probably was recommended 180, which would put him in that, let's see, ultra severe actually. Severe to ultra severe, yeah, is what we would recommend, what we would put him into. It wouldn't be just from one test though. You understand that we do combinations of tests. So you get a little more, you know, precise with that.
Okay. Is 6 years old a good age to start reading and spelling programs?
Absolutely. Even 5 years is good, but you know, build the foundations. I mean, at age 5, you want to do some phonemic awareness activities with a child to start building the foundation for the relationship between a sound and the letter. So at age 5, children will have a great deal of difficulty segmenting the word into its sounds. If you ask a 5-year-old what the sounds are in the word cat, they'll probably say cat. They'll just repeat the word. But if you say, let's focus on what your mouth is saying, what's the first thing your mouth is saying when you say cat, and get them to pay attention to what the mouth shape is taking. And then if they still can't get it, you just tell them the first sound is k, like that. And then each make out, you know, show them the mouth forms and what your mouth is saying, what is happening with the motor articulation in your mouth when you say the sound. So bring it back to what the child is saying, because you want to eventually develop the idea in their mind that what is written is their speech. So they're speaking, and this is how we spell what you are saying. So we never say letters say the sound. You know, what sound does the letter C say? Well, the letter C doesn't talk. You do, right? So what sound do you hear? What sound do you say? What sound do you say when you take the first sound in the word cat. What's the first sound you say? And then this is how we spell it. And then you show them how you spell it. You do that for all the sounds. So age, I don't think it's ever too early to encourage reading in your child. I mean, you know, I read to both of my daughters when they were born, brought home from the hospital and born. And I think it's just a nice thing. It was just a nice time to spend with them. So I didn't expect them to become readers because of that. But I just wanted them to hear the different kind of prosody and cadence that goes on when you read to somebody and reading stories to them, and to develop that love of books and reading. And then you can point out certain things to them when they're 3 years old, what a page is and what the graphics are and all the rest of it, what words are. You can give them those kinds of features. But to actually learn how to read, they must learn the alphabet principle, and that is how sounds are represented by letters. And in English, that's tricky because we don't have that, we don't have a lot of that one-to-one correspondence like they do in the transparent languages. So I'll stop talking. Next question.
Okay, there is an emphasis to diagnose children that are dyslexic prior to grade 3 to ensure success in reading. How do we ensure that children that are diagnosed at grade 5 or later reach success and catch up? Or will it always be the case that they will always be behind?
I think for some of them, they will always be behind. Yes. And I think the more delayed they are, the more intensive one-on-one they need. And where are they going to get intensive one-on-one in the school system? It's just not going to happen. So that's why I say on a practical level, you have to have accommodations for these children and extra time and all the rest of it.
And I want to say as well, not even in the private schools.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a good point.
They're so busy
Yeah.
keeping up with the curriculum.
Correct.
But,
That's correct.
they don't have time for the remediation part of it.
Yeah.
My youngest, who has severe dyslexia, was in a remedial, lucky her, in a remedial program, but not until grade 5 in the public system for 3 months. And it went from 9 a.m. until noon. For 3 months, her reading levels went up. They were using a Linda Mood Bell combination with something else. Her levels went up maybe half a year or a year. We were astonished. But that's what it takes. It takes intensive.
Yes, intensive one-on-one. You cannot fool around.
And she didn't really do any other subjects, so that her brain wasn't getting filled with French and whatever else, right? So it means something for a severe dyslexic to have remediation.
Absolutely. That's such a good point, Cathy, because the argument all the time that I hear from educators was, how can your child come to your clinic for 4 hours every day and miss a half a day of school? They're missing all this content, all this curriculum. And I'm saying they can't read.
Yes, exactly.
They can't read. Hello.
Also, they have the ability. Principal is in BC, and I think it's the same in Alberta. The principal is ultimately responsible for the IEP legally. That's who's responsible.
Yeah. And
before they hit high school, they could not be at school and nothing really matters except for from a dyslexic parent's point of view, but reading, writing, and math, right? If they don't have those basics, they're not going to get through high school. Legally, within their IEP, if they have an IEP, they could miss, my daughter went for 3 months for half a day and did the remediation within public school and came back and did math and gym class. That's all she did. And that literally was on her IEP. And if you want to do it privately, you can do that as well. And if the school tells you any differently, they're a little bit confused. So if you have a problem asking for it, you come and that's good to know. Yeah,
that's really good information for everybody, because I think the situation in BC is a little more student friendly, family friendly than what we hear in other places. That like I'm still getting this. Well, they're missing all the school time. So how's the child going to keep up with all the curriculum? So the curriculum comes first, and of course I don't blame teachers. That's what they're mandated to do, is teach the curriculum. But when you have And again, this is where a diagnosis does help. If you have a diagnosis and it says, you know, this has to be part of the IEP, and they can miss school time for that, that's a wonderful concession.
Exactly.
That opens the door. I mean, I know Ontario doesn't have that either, because we have our clinic in Toronto, and we are fighting with schools a lot on that issue.
Yeah, well,
We're not fighting, but you know.
we have a special category in BC, which I hope they don't get rid of, because they keep talking about making the model different and just sort of making it a big generic model. We have categories, 12 or 13 different special needs categories. So we have our own special need category. So we are considered, if you get designated as a special needs student. So say someone is on the autism spectrum, they let kids on the autism spectrum all the time go out for ABA therapy, and it's written right into their IEP.
Right.
But for some reason, the misperception about LD kids is just give them accommodations and let them keep up with the curriculum. But
Yeah.
like I said, until high school, that principal has the authority, and I'm sure it's legally, it's the same in Alberta. It's just sort of buried to accommodate that, right? Like
Right.
if I basically tell parents, if kids on the autism spectrum get to leave school and they still graduate, then your kid gets to leave school and still graduate. If someone broke their leg and had to go to the doctor to have that fixed, or I knew someone who was in the hospital, a child that was in the hospital for a month, and they have programs the kids do. They might not keep up with the curriculum, but they're keeping up with their math and their spelling, and I'm like, high school is a whole different ballgame.
Right.
But yeah, when it comes to learning the history of something, I mean, elementary school, I'm not saying it's a piece of cake, but if it has to do with a disability and remediation, that trumps a lot of things.
Well, I think that's very good advice for all the parents out there. Excellent. I know as well in Vancouver, we've had children on the autism spectrum who've actually been funded to come to the clinic.
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
a pretty generous grant that they get for that.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
that can also apply to the LD kids, which is kind of what you're implying. I don't know if that's true, but if it,
No, we don't come with any funding.
yeah, you don't.
but
Okay, so
we do have a designation.
if you have the designation, then you shouldn't have to be arguing with the school about whether or not the child can attend.
Yes, exactly.
And
So
I
that's,
think my message to
they-
parents is, you know what, that is in the best interest of your child. It absolutely is in the best interest of your child to attend a clinic like ours, because that's one of the few ways that you're going to start that gap, seeing that gap really start closing. And
Yeah.
it makes a huge difference to the child's life in the long term.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
it's a big investment, but it's an investment in their future.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Next. Is there any other questions?
There's a few, yep, quite a
Okay.
few.
Okay.
Okay, so finding time to remediate is really difficult in schools. How can we argue for intensive intervention hours through advocacy? Do you know of groups, methods to support school-based change that address remediation?
Well, I think that's starting to happen, but I think Cathy's already given you some good, advice on that one. But how do you start advocating?
You start with,
I've been advocating since I started the clinic, and been beating my head against the wall. But what I've been seeing in the last couple of years is a big sea change. So the schools are moving more towards, I'm going to call it phonics, although that's a dirty word, but there's more phonics based, and I'm hoping that I can shift people into really exploring linguistic phonics as a better way to go for prevention. So start advocating for your teachers to get trained in programs like EBLI and Reading Simplified. Those are excellent programs with lots of materials, lots of everything that you need to become trained to really do a good job in your school. So it's up to parents individually and as groups to advocate for the right kind of programs in the school systems. And so I don't want to, get into another type of war over phonics versus no phonics. This is, the evidence is pretty clear that you need some very structured phonics. And my take is that the linguistic phonics is a better perspective than just any old phonics. Anyway, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
This person said that they have a child in university that studied at the Reading Foundation. She's doing fine now, but needs medication for ADHD. She did a psych ed and her results stated everything was now normal. The individual is 53 and was diagnosed with dyslexia, but never treated in any intense manner. They have a successful life and use Audible as their main tool to take in information, but they're interested if you have any suggestions to help with reading potential.
Wow. Well, we've had, first of all, I guess it's never too late. But you still need to get the one-on-one intervention and enough of it to really make a difference. If your life is just fine the way you are, the way you've accommodated yourself, I think that's great. Use Audible and all the rest of it. But if you're serious about changing, then you need to get the intervention I'm talking about. And it doesn't matter about your age. I can tell one story that's very significant in my mind is when the clinic opened many years ago. We had a gentleman from the US who was injured at work and could not return to his job, but the workman's compensation paid for him for rehabilitation. And he wanted to be rehabilitated to become a pilot so that he could read and pass the pilot's exam. And they would not allow accommodations no matter what your disability was. You had to pass it yourself. You had to read it yourself and answer it yourself, all the questions yourself, and write it out and all the rest of it. So he moved his entire family to Calgary for like 3 months and got training in our program for those 3 months. He went over to the US and took the exam and passed it. And his wife tells us that his spelling is still awful, but he doesn't stop reading. So it's wonderful,
Okay, great. A severe 6th grader is getting OG training and has advanced through the basic level. While these are nice gains, he is still struggling to blend consistently. Do you think lacking advanced phonological awareness is part of the problem? And could you share any suggestions to help him?
Well, yeah, I would. I mean, I'm afraid to say it. I'm not trying to slag OG. I think it does a really good job up to a certain point, but what was just described now is the point where the child needs to shift to an entirely different program. So get somebody who's been trained in the LIPS program or phonographics, or explore the clinical option. That's the best bet now, because with a stronger foundation, in phonics, we can do probably take a little less time to do the intervention, but I really need to know where it's breaking down with the child. So we always do a pre-testing to find out where that's happening, and then we can individualize. Yeah, there aren't any quick fixes for this. There's just aren't. There just aren't. But you have to get advanced phonological training or stimulation, and it has to be integrated into the entire program. So you can buy, for example, Dr. Kilpatrick's book. It's called Equipped for Reading Success. It's got 1-minute activities in there that are advanced phonological training. But if you just do them, you're not going to get the transfer to real reading, because you have to integrate those activities with the remedial process itself. Yeah. So it's a problem. It's a problem. You need really skilled people to deal with these issues. Skilled training. Okay. Yeah. Okay, next.
Okay, this person recommends associating efficient automatic letter formation with phoneme production for the purpose of invented spelling as an early writing strategy. How might this strategy affect a student with dyslexia?
Wow, you got to read that again. What is it again? Associated what?
Associating efficient automatic letter formation with phoneme production for the purpose of invented spelling.
Well, okay, alphabet production is really important, first of all. So if a child has difficulty producing the letters of the alphabet, it's a separate problem from dyslexia, but it's going to affect their spelling production. So I would not focus terribly on developing efficient letter production, because that's not the key. Yeah. So if you want a better reader, then you have to get into the phonemic awareness stuff. if you want a better speller, you do have to deal with the delay with the handwriting if it's not good letter formation. So that's a problem that we face all the time, because some of the kids that come to us really should do some maybe 20 hours of a handwriting program where they can learn the letter formation. But what we're trying to do next, and I'm rewriting the program, is we're trying to integrate the writing so that it's part of what we do. But I wouldn't spend hours and hours and hours at it. I mean, you know, these printing activities should be, you know, if you're doing it at home with your child, 5 to 10 minutes, that's it. If it's part of a remedial program and you're working for an hour with a child, it should be 3 minutes, 5 minutes. It shouldn't consume the hour. You know, it's not needed. And it does have to be delayed or dealt with because it will delay the production of the spelling. But in the meantime, as an accommodation, you can use letter tiles. You know, take out some old Scrabble tiles and tell the child to ignore the numbers. You can use the letter tiles that way, or create your own.
I think, Steve, what she thinks is that the letter formation is actually part of the remediation, but I mean.
Well, yes, it is. It is a good point that she's raising there, and I don't want to ignore that. Learning how to print the letters properly does give that extra graphomotor stimulation, and does tie in better with the motor activity of the brain, and does help the production of the letters and retention. So it's all good stuff. But if it becomes all time consuming, then that's not what the child needs.
Yeah, it should be dependent on how the severity is and what is the most important thing at the time.
Yeah. Now we do one of the charts I didn't show you. I have similar charts I showed you for the RAT5 reading, but our spelling gains are very strong as well. And the children on the RAT5 have to spell the words, and their printing usually does improve because we put some attention on it. But we could be doing a lot more of that, but then we'd be taking away from the rest of the program, which is very important. You know, so it's not a good trade-off to spend all your time on printing, is what I'm saying. Sorry, next question.
This one actually is for Cathy from Dyslexia BC. Just a clarification. You mentioned that for kids with a psych ed, there's money through insurance or tax rebates. The person missed it. Can you please repeat how to get that portion covered?
Okay, so most extended medical plans cover like psychology fees. So like it's the same fees that you might use for counseling of some sort. Most plans will cover about 6 hours of a psych ed, and a lot of clinics here in BC will, because the report is written for the parents, they will include 6 hours from the parents as well. And that can cover almost a full psych ed. You can also, once you have the psych ed, claim it as a medical expense, which you get 20% back on your taxes. And if it is severe enough, you can claim the disability tax credit, but disability tax credit is reserved for severe cases. We are having a session on the disability tax credit on February the 8th. So if you want to come and join us for that session, you're more than welcome. Yeah, that's about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. Is DIBELS an acceptable screening tool to measure a child's ability? This person got an independent psych ed with a diagnosis, but the school says there's no evidence of diagnosis as per DIBELS. Her child, I'm assuming, gets 30 minutes of small group reading with 2 other kids 4 times a week as his only accommodation in his IEP, with foundations, it looks like. And he only attends sometimes because he's embarrassed when it's not one-on-one instruction, and sometimes even then. This individual does not know how to advocate further for her child.
Well, if it's tough if you're giving up in the first place. You know, you have to advocate. You know, this is not an acceptable route, really. You're going to get into this nonsense about, you know, what sort of tests do we use?
Yeah.
DIBELS is sort of a group screening test. It's not it's not diagnostic, in my opinion. It serves some sort of purpose, but to put it ahead of a psycho-ed that's just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, no, not at all.
And then this foundations, which is part of the Wilson program. Again, many comments from many parents are that they just level off, because foundations does not let them go to the next step until they have achieved mastery of the first, the prior steps. And that's not going to work. So the child's in the wrong kind of setting and group setting, and if all they're doing is repeated reading, your gains at the end of 2 or 3 years of that are going to be in that, first column at best. That's not what you want. So, you have to start, I think it's time for me to really start getting parents and professionals to start thinking about what works as an efficient program. It's not a question of putting a strategy together. Teachers need a whole program, and they need to be taught how to administer the program, how to deliver the program, how to screen children for the program, how to treat them, how to deal with difficulties as they're going through the program. All of that is taking place with that program that I mentioned in Northern Alberta. That's a fantastic way to deal with it. And the system, the superintendent of schools was on, or one of the school districts was on, and he was talking about they don't even want to hear about Fontes and Pinnell. They just tossed it out the window. So they have the right kind of screening tools. They're using them in kindergarten. They have the right way to keep track of the program development of those children. And they know what to do when the child is struggling. So they know how to treat that. Now, I wrote to Dr. Georgiou, and I said, well, my experience is that you're still going to get kids, even if you're doing all these things properly, you're still going to get kids who are quite delayed. And he said, yeah, we are. So, they're still there. And there's still the need for this intensive one-on-one remedial model to happen either in the school system or privately or wherever, and that's I'm talking about now of shifting a school population that's doing the right thing from kindergarten and grade 1, screening and then treating. So they are going to be shifting those children into more and more accomplished readers, right? But they're still going to get those laggards, and we have to deal with those children as well. So these are important shifts that are taking place, I think, in the educational system as a whole. And we should be seeing all kinds of results over time that are going to be diminishing the number of children who need any kind of intensive service to begin with. But in the meantime, we have children who have been graduating for 100 years in the system the way it is now, with very little change. Who are, we have kids in grade 7 who can't read a word to come to the clinic. And you say, how did they get through 7 years of schooling or 6 years of schooling and they can't read anything? They're so delayed, it just makes you cry. It's just an awful thing. So we've got these thousands of children that need remediation, accommodation, all kinds of things. And they don't need to be diagnosed to get that. They just need something now. They just something has to happen sooner rather than later for them. Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting on a soapbox there. I don't want to. What's the next question?
Let's stop with the questions in the chat, and maybe we'll just go through them. I think there's just a couple more here because it's getting late. I know it's later for you. So let's ask until we've got the questions that are up on here.
Okay.
And then anyone else, can you email me questions in the next day or so? And we will send out an email. What we'll do is address those questions. If we don't hear from you by, what is today, Tuesday? By Thursday, your question won't be incorporated into the final email. And then I'll send out a final email maybe Friday or Monday. So does that work for everybody? I guess
it does. And then I also put up my email address if you want to ask any personal questions too. It's up there.
Tonight I'll put out my email, Amanda's email, and Steve's email, and you can email us whatever questions directly. And then the group final up email will come Monday, and that's the way it'll work. So Amanda, do you want to just continue reading the questions?
Yep, for sure. So the next one was, exactly what is the BC education rationale for accommodation is sufficient?
Well, even whether they give the proper accommodations, I have no idea. It's either a lack of understanding or lack of resources, right? Like, yeah.
Well, it's also what the system has done forever, ever since
Yeah.
school psychologists, and ever since the learning disability thing came up, is that, you know, after years of sort of saying, well, if we catch the kids in grade 1, we shouldn't need any kind of special ed in grade 3. That would have been true 40 years ago if they had been doing the right kind of program. You would have far fewer kids, but they weren't. So what they found was that by grade 3, they weren't remediated. Well, surprise, surprise, based on what we know now. And so then it became, well, maybe by the end of elementary school. Well, no, even then, you see, they're still not remediated. So then it's like, well, we can't remediate. See, then it's like, oh, it's impossible because they have a disability.
Yes.
So now we will accommodate.
Yeah.
You see, now
But
we will
also,
accommodate. The system will accommodate. We can't remediate. Don't expect us to, because it's not even possible. That's that very entrenched way of thinking right now, still in the system. So all of that has to change before your questions can be, and your children can be dealt with properly.
yeah, most teacher, or most, the system seems to think absolutely no reading is taught after about elementary school, I think.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And then, as I said earlier, is that just the idea that they always have to be keeping up with the curriculum. Well, you know, what's more important, learning to read or learning, I don't know.
Yeah, learning when the Battle of Hastings took place. You know, I don't know. You're right. I mean, you know, what are the priorities? And to me, it's like the parents who put their children in private schools where they actually get remediation, like Sally Shaywitz was quoting from her work.
Mhm.
That's an appropriate placement. They're getting some degree of remediation, plus they're getting some curriculum. But the emphasis is more on process than it is curriculum. And I think that's what's important for the child, because you want that skill set to develop as time goes on. The other strengths that children who have the dyslexia label have, they take over. The children's, you know, that you're going to become a successful entrepreneur, a businessman, or you know, an artist if you have those other skills. But if you can't read and spell,
Yeah.
I know from the stories of the adults who come for 30 years to the clinic, it's heartbreaking.
Well, the biggest voice, the biggest voice in that campaign that everybody's an entrepreneur is Richard Branson. Well,
Yeah.
you know what? He was born a millionaire.
Yeah.
So you know, it's great and dandy if your parents give you millions of dollars and you can go and buy an airline. That's a whole different ballgame than being born on the east side of Vancouver, you know.
Yeah, and those, you know, those factors are part of everybody's life, right? It's part of our, and you know, I've always said, I mean, I don't care if you're going to be an electrician or a lawyer or a plumber, but you want to be able to read and write, you know, no matter what your profession is. And again, the people who have become successful but were dyslexic when they were kids have come to the clinic for remediation. Their stories, like I said, are heartbreaking. You know, they're at the top of the heap as far as making money or being, you know, the leader of their business or whatever, but they still can't read, and it eats at them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just eats at your soul.
I met with some politicians the other day, and they were talking about, oh, well, you know, Fraser Academy, blah, blah, that's a private school here that does OG only. And I said, well, okay, to give an example, like Rick Moore's child who went to Fraser Academy, and Kenneth Gordon, he started in grade 2, and sure, he went to BCIT with accommodations and he got a job as a plumber, But you know what he had to do? He had to go back to the office and dictate his whole day to the secretary who would type it for him. So his parents paid. Fraser Academy now is 42,000 a year.
Wow.
A year.
Okay.
And when we looked there, my daughter was in grade 2. So 42,000 a year.
Mhm.
And a neighbor whose son was also dyslexic said, well, Cathy, do you want your kid to make it through, or do you want your kid to read? And at the time, my daughter was in grade 2. I didn't really know what she meant.
Mhm.
Well, they all go to college, they all go to university. Well, is your kid reading? And so, and this, how old is Rick Moore's kid? Jeff, I think, is about 35 now, but he gets help with his taxes. He not on Facebook because anyways, the list is on. He's still very dyslexic, and he went all the way through private school. So did he get the proper remediation? Is he gonna always be dyslexic? Anyways, these are all questions as parents we have to ask ourselves. Do we want our kid increasing their reading level? About grade 6, we said with my daughter, that's enough. She's had enough outside school. She's just got to live her life now. And she's at university with lots of accommodations. But, you know, and I said to her at some point, you can go to the Reading Foundation and get more remediation. These are all questions as parents we have to think and about, because you know, it's business.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you if that's what the tuition fee is, and it's probably not unusual to find numbers like that anymore in Canada. For a year, I can tell you that 1 year of, well, not 1 year, 1 year's tuition would cover unbelievable amounts of closing the gap with our clinics. I mean, that's just no question there. And and the thing is, I've got the data to show you. You know, that is not me just selling. I've got the data to show you what we do.
Yeah.
I have to just blow my own horn a little bit because, you know, Dr. David Kilpatrick, I think many of you have heard of him. He's one of the, you know, well-known research stars in the reading world. He thinks this, you know, the Reading Foundation is one of the best clinics anywhere. So that's saying something, I think. I said, what do you mean anywhere? He said, anywhere, probably anywhere in the world. Wow. That's high praise.
There isn't very many clinics that are remedial centers. So like yours, are there? Is there any?
Yeah, there's lots of Lindenwood Bell clinics. There's a few, like Morris Center I mentioned, they have, I think, at least 3 clinics. There's spin-offs where people who like myself were trained at Lindenwood Bell originally and then started their own clinic. So there's lots of, you know, remedial intervention clinics. So if you find one of them and they're using the right program, you're probably going to get good results. You know, I'm not just trying to sell us. I mean, I'm selling the program. The way that it's taught is really, really important. And then you get down into, well, how were the people trained in the clinics and how well do they record keep and how well do they individualize? Because I can tell you, when we start dealing with these children that are in that severe and ultra severe and extremely severe categories, the amount of adjustment we have to make to our own program is unbelievable. I mean, just unbelievable amounts of time spent on accommodating and not accommodating, but revising our techniques to get at what's still blocking that child. And that's why I think we can still move even that group along 16, 17 standard score points. Yeah, it takes longer, but that's the reality of being delayed. It takes longer to get to where you want to go. But you can get there, and teaching is the key. Teaching with the right stuff is the key. Yeah.
Especially if you go earlier.
Oh yeah. Well,
the
again,
person that said, well, if they're doing okay by grade 3, you know, do I need to worry? You know, as a parent, like they say that after grade, what is it, 3, it takes 4 times as long to remediate. So if you have severe dyslexic, if you're hitting grade 3, they're never going to fill that gap ever, right? If you're mild to moderate, you might have a chance if you get in there at grade 1. So
you'll have more than a good chance if you get into the right stuff in the first place. So that's
exactly.
That's my message tonight. And you know, it's never too late to close the gap. The gap can always be closed, but the more delayed you are and the longer you're there, then yeah, it can take longer. But my little pilot story, that should tell you something. You know, that was a, I forget how old he was, 55 or something like that. This is a gentleman who spent 3 months with us, and that was it. And he went out and got something that he never dreamed of being able to accomplish in his whole life. So, you know, we didn't remediate him totally, but we got him his license on his own merits, you know, his own reading and his own writing. Yeah. So this is a story I hear from so many parents. You know, my child spent whatever, 2 months in your clinic, and they learned more in the first week than they ever did in school, you know, for 3 years, that kind of stuff. So, and then the kids will say, how come they don't teach this in school? You know, yeah, right. Okay. Next question.
You know what, Steve? It's getting pretty late, and I've got all the questions written down. So maybe that's a good time to stop, and then
Okay.
we can answer them via email, and then add any that anybody has to add in the next few days.
I will send in an email tonight so that you have all of our direct emails on your computer, so it makes it easier.
Good.
So.
Okay, well, I hope everybody enjoyed themselves as much as I did, because I had a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
I hope I conveyed some good information tonight, besides just getting on a soapbox every once in a while and yapping away. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming, and I wish you all well on your journey with you and your children. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. All right, I guess I will log out. We'll talk to you later.
All
Thanks so
righty.
much.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye.
Bye-bye.